Dead by Daylight is an asymmetrical survival horror game that comprises its lobbies of 4 survivors, either solo queue or partied up, against a single killer with unique abilities. It's quickly become one of my favourites, and despite how infuriating it can be at times, it's an extremely replayable multiplayer game. Since its release in 2016, the developers, Behaviour Interactive, have developed a DLC release model, where every few months, a new survivor, killer, map, or all 3 are added to the game. While it's clearly only here for the sake of money, it helps to keep the game fresh considering how repetitive it can be sometimes. The killers are definitely the most common thing to review in this game, but I think that the realms are really worth discussing as well, and unfortunately don't go as talked about. I also say realms because Dead by Daylight has far too many actual maps for me to rank in a long form video, and most of them are so similar to each other to the point that I simply don't have much to say about them. So grouping them together is a really interesting idea. So yeah, every Dead by Daylight realm ranked from worst to best. Now, obviously some realms have more maps than others, so in order to make this fair, I'm going to calculate average scores across all maps in a certain realm, and round them to the nearest integer, or 0.5. At the end of each section, I'll list all of the map scores, plus their calculated averages, and position them based off of that. It's only fair that I do this because some realms get airlifted by their best maps, and if not for the bad eggs, they'd all end up near the top, and we wouldn't have a video worth making. Each realm will be ranked based on its visual aesthetic, how balanced it is overall for both killers and survivors, and my personal enjoyment. Just a disclaimer that I am a survivor main, meaning that most of the footage in this video will be from the perspective of a survivor, but I will try my best not to let that have too much influence on the results. And finally, while I am ranking the realms, I'm going to be using the terms map and realm interchangeably and refer to each by what most people know them as. For example, with Gideon Meat Plant I'll call it The Game, and for Grave of Glenvale I'll call it Dead Dog Saloon. Really excited for this one, guys, so let's begin. Badham Preschool is an absolutely atrocious map. The bottom 3 maps of this list are my so-called ungodly trinity that I'll always try and disconnect from if I get them, and Badham is the first and to me the worst of these 3. I know a lot of people would put a map like RPD here instead, and you'll come to find out how much I dislike that one too. But there is a gigantic difference between a map that looks nice but sucks to play no matter what side you're on, and 4 almost completely safe locations combined with convenient generators and drab visuals. Balancing in this game is definitely a debatable topic, but Badham is so clearly survivor-sided to the point that it's no longer fun for anyone. Maybe it's just me, but I don't want to play a map that is either boring or unbearable depending on which side I play. If I ever get a good play against a killer, it doesn't feel nearly as satisfying as it would on a more balanced realm, or even a killer-sided one. And playing killer on Badham, I will stand by until the end of time as the most miserable experience you can have in Dead by Daylight. Just having a bad killer experience might not seem like enough, and it definitely isn't, but even as survivor the map sucks. The generators are definitely way too convenient, but a lot of them are either limited to a single person or have extremely long sightlines. Unless I'm in some kind of party, there's no way I'm going to finish the match without feeling like I just wasted 15 minutes of my life. There are also somehow 5 different varieties of Badham, though I'm yet to notice a single difference between them and see no reason to go over them separately. With all that said though, the realm actually doesn't look that bad, it's just a bit generic and forgettable. It's the one thing keeping it from being completely worthless to me, as well as the loots being kind of fun sometimes. Either give it a rework or remove it from the game. 2 out of 10, and that's being generous. Yet another terrible realm in Dead by Daylight is ironically Garden of Joy. This one has the exact same problems as Badham, but in some ways might be even more pathetic. Because even though it has less of those ultra safe areas, there are practically no dead zones unless the killer creates them by continually disrespecting the pallets. And wherever there isn't an abundance of safe pallets or structures, there's an insane amount of tiles and obstacles for survivors to use to their advantage and chase. None of Garden's structures on their own are necessarily bad. For example, the house, which can actually be quite fun, but as soon as that structure is left, you run into 3 or 4 other loops, pallets, or windows. Just like Badham, while it's worse for killers, the realm sucks for survivors too. I can't tell you how many games I've had where multiple gens get completed in just a few minutes, but no one escapes. While the game in general leaves a team vulnerable if a survivor is sacrificed, this map seems to escalate way too quickly. The very snowball-like gameplay means that killers like Oni, Hag, or Trapper should logically be better here. but the map is just so big that it ends up being only painful with no payoff. There's no incentive to chase the survivors because of the priorly mentioned lack of dead zones, so it just feels hopeless. It's maps like these that make me dread playing Killer sometimes. The way I describe it makes it sound like the sheer amount of obstacles and things in the way would make the map look cluttered, but honestly, I'm pleased to report that I love the look of the map. It's definitely an unpopular opinion, but it has a really nice gothic look. I failed to mention in my ranking of the Hitman locations how awesome Dartmoor actually looks, as bland of a map as it is, and I get the same kind of feeling here. Except unlike Dartmoor, the visual aesthetic isn't enough to save Garden of Joy. As Killer it sucks because chases aren't worth pursuing most of the time, and as Survivor it's just not as intense because you basically just get handed loops and obstacles. Another realm that needs to either be reworked or removed. 3 out of 10 and that is all it gets. Capping off my unholy trinity with a realm that was reworked a few months back, but still sucks in my opinion. 𝐓𝐢𝐴Z𝐵, or however the heck you pronounce it, is garbage. While some think that the changes improved the gameplay on the map, others, like me, think that it was a minor change at best and the biggest problems with the map still loom. Making it smaller was definitely a W, but the size wasn't even the main problem to begin with. It also wasn't even that much of a decrease. As far as I know, they just made the map more square and reworked the layout of the landmarks. I don't necessarily think that a map being huge means that it's automatically bad, but this one absolutely is bad because all the size does is add to my frustrations with it. My main frustrations with it are like Garden, convenient chains of powerful loops and structures, and like Badham, the structures themselves suck in terms of balancing. The main building, as mentioned before, for example, is awful. There are so many overpowered windows, and while there are breakable doors too, there's a ton of looping potential with the 2 floors, and a somewhat annoying to navigate layout. There's also significant risk involved for survivors, because if a pallet isn't available upstairs, then you get a one-way ticket to the hook. I've complained a bit about the gameplay, but what about the visuals? They're enough to make the map bearable, but they're still pretty generic. With a realm like the Red Forest, specifically the Temple of Purgation map, it just pulls off the ancient vibes so much better. And despite the fact that it's not perfect in terms of balancing either, gaining map control for either side seems much fairer there than it is on 𝐓𝐢𝐴Z𝐵. I'm sure some people would like the uncertainty, risk and complexity of this map, but I don't. There's a few more upcoming that suck too, but we're at least past the worst of it now. 3 out of 10. As I said before, I have a so-called unholy trinity of bad realms that I really hate to be on and sometimes flat out refuse to play. I knew that those realms would make up the bottom 3, but the next 3 realms on this list I knew would rank low as well. Though I was a lot less certain as to their actual positions, as they each have major pros and cons that even them out a bit. The realm that ended up here is Decimated Borgo, which is so bad. It's not overly big, nor is it really sided, it just pisses me off in a way that many don't. The generators aren't very close together, making it harder for killers, but they're mostly in plain sight, meaning that some can be disrupted. Just not quite at the frequency of a free gen if the survivors play their cards right. There's also not many safe structures for the survivors to use, only a somewhat safe main building and the shack. The map being big helps survivors to gain back a competitive edge over the killer, which honestly leads it into being a relatively balanced map overall. Why in the hell does this map have so many pallets? I've heard from some sources that it has the most pallets of any map, and yep, it does seem like it. The 2 safe structures on the map, as mentioned before, are not very powerful on their own, but throw it in with the insane amount of pallets and it makes it so the structures may as well not be there. The very red aesthetic also makes trying to follow blood trails or scratch marks needlessly difficult. It's one of the few maps where I actually end up losing survivors if I slug for the 4K, because the map does such a good job of concealing them. It's actually a blatant oversight on the side of the developers because tracking is quite a big part of the game for killers, and survivors in fact. So let's say that you make the best use of your advantages as survivor and try to buy some time for your teammates. There's a ton of obstacles you could accidentally get stuck on while looping, and the chases aren't very intuitive or fun because more than any other map it's just pallet drop, run to another pallet, pallet drop, run to another, and it keeps repeating until you get downed or the killer gives up. The worst kinds of maps in my opinion are the ones where you're encouraged to drop pallets faster than rain because there isn't so much of the so-called mind games that ramp up the adrenaline. It becomes very repetitive very quickly. Some of these problems might have been forgivable if the map at least looked good, but it just looks like complete shit. It's yet another one of these realms that has no business having this many obstacles, and as someone who generally loves medieval or fantasy settings, it is really disappointing. This map is really bad, but to me there are reasons that justify it being outside of the bottom 3. Number 1 is that it isn't extremely painful, it's just boring and unfun, and 2, the sightlines being what they are mean that the survivor experience is generally a bit more intense, as the killer and you make contact more often. So yeah, it's at least a small step up from the previous few, but they really need to stop making realms like this. 4 out of 10. Raccoon City Police Department, or RPD as everyone calls it, is so visually stunning and the aesthetic is among my favourites. I'm still yet to play the Resident Evil games so I can't really comment on that too much, but it looks like Behaviour have recreated RPD to a T, which is some amazing work from the artists, especially those in the assets department. So it's really sad that a realm so visually awesome ends up being the worst licensed one for me. I mean, apart from Badham, but that was a somewhat original creation. It's the first one on the list that I don't think is explicitly sided as much as it is awful for everyone equally. Oh wait, I forgot. RPD is actually our first realm with multiple maps, the East Wing and the West Wing. Both of the maps have really long winding corridors on either end, which on paper makes it ideal for killers like Billy, Blight, or rather fittingly Wesker, but there's just so many objects and corners that Billy could accidentally chainsaw, a very high skill ceiling for Blight also due to the amount of objects, and plenty of immediate exits, whether pallet based or just a random doorway, to dodge Wesker's charges. It isn't necessarily bad if killers suck on certain maps, but both of the RPD maps are still absolutely huge, so it screws you over no matter which killer you play. Every option is bad. As Survivor, you have those advantages with the quote-unquote charge killers, but you are completely fucked as soon as you want to pallet loop any killer, because seemingly every pallet is unsafe. There's not even a shack, meaning that you only really have one super safe area, which is of course the main entrance hall. It does help to even the playing field in addition to the removal of that extra area in the library, as there's not as many unfair spots and there is a little bit of what resembles a good realm. The next safest areas that I can think of are the west and east offices, which I wouldn't call god locations as much as they are high density, as it's super easy to slip up with any one of the pallets or windows at your disposal and most of them are useless anyway. The West Wing definitely has more visual detail and possibly faithfulness to the game, but it's really big and has stupidly long sightlines, especially with the generators that spawn in the corridor next to the STARS office. There's also that back staircase connecting it to the ground floor that I always miss, which just adds to the needless complexity. While I definitely prefer the East Wing to the West Wing, as the outdoor areas and the building immediately next to them are a nice change of pace and actually have some fair loops, both maps just have a number of big problems regardless and not enough good to redeem themselves. There really are just so many areas in here for the sake of it, with only a handful being genuinely beneficial. I personally think that a ton of rooms could just be blocked off for the sake of the killer's sanity in public games, but also some pallets could be moved, such as that terrible one in the dark room from the desk to the door, and in doing so creating an actually useful loop. Massive points to the development team for the design and implementation of the department, but definitely lackluster and really unfit for a game like Dead by Daylight. 4 out of 10. Crotus Pren Asylum is yet another realm that I simply do not care for. I used to think that it was fine, but that's a bygone era. It just really frustrates me how that neat gothic style seems to end up on the exact types of maps that I don't enjoy. And that goes for any game, not just Dead by Daylight. Though with that said, it's not actually that frustrating because only the central structures, the ward and the chapel seem to actually follow this visual style. If the main structures are ignored, then it's possibly my least favourite looking realm in the entire game, because the other sites, if any, either contrast too harshly or blend too well, and the lighting is poorly done. A lot of the older realms look a little dated and flat, but some of them need to be completely overhauled, because it can actually have a big impact on the gameplay. On both of these maps, coordinated survivor teams have too big of an advantage if they want to play stealthily, because it is downright impossible to see them sometimes. And if the bad lighting wasn't enough, both of the maps, Disturbed Ward especially, are some of the biggest offenders when it comes to being large with excessive palettes and tiles. The realm really likes to use these cobble squares with a single palette, which can be a little risky but seem to be mostly safe. On their own, I find them pretty fun, on both sides actually, but I often don't commit to them as killer because as soon as the palette is dropped, there's usually another close by, and it ends up being a waste of time. As horribly sided as it is, I honestly think I like the ward more. Maybe it's my survivor bias at play here, but these maps only really differ in their size and primary structures, and I prefer the ward to the chapel because of its detailing, and just the general gameplay experience. That still doesn't mean it's good though. It's very forgiving to survivors, full of risky pickup spots that can be abused, and actually has an infinite loop, which is just unacceptable. This map can turn in the killer's favour though, and especially with a stealth killer that knows what they're doing. As with Ghostface and Michael, you can get people outside to full stalk using the upstairs floor, and there's plenty of objects to conceal yourself behind. This is in no way a justification for the map though, as it's very situational and entirely based on the killer that you're playing. While the chapel is much better, it's still got its problems. It has a mostly safe but somewhat risky central structure and an easy to patrol generator, and the map is much smaller, but it starts to get very repetitive when the so-called square loops start getting used, because there's quite a few in close proximity. I think it would be a lot better if they move one of them to the carnival because that whole area sucks for survivors regardless of what spawns in. I don't think the carnival being killer-sided justifies the survivor sympathy in any way either. It's just another needless addition. Crotus Pren, like many older realms, is very outdated, but it could have been worse, so we do have that to be grateful for. 4 out of 10. I don't think that 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐚𝐦 is too exciting, but I also don't think it's that bad. It's the point in which my opinions in this list become milder, and where the just okay maps start to appear. I've always loved winter themed maps, and this one's no exception. Some people have said to me that the added snow is just annoying and gets in the way, and while I get that, I personally don't mind it. In fact, it even serves somewhat of a purpose, as the map has some of the longest sightlines in the game, and while it is rare, it sometimes makes up for those long sightlines by slightly obscuring my view as killer. Though with that said, I don't think this map needed any more survivor aid. It's another map that is very clearly sided with no shame whatsoever. It's 156 tiles, so it's definitely on the bigger side, but the central structure is also unfortunately reminiscent of 𝐓𝐲𝐻𝐻. Lots of escapes, lots of pallets, sometimes shockingly safe ones as well, and quite a large area size. It's still better than 𝐓𝐲𝐻𝐻 though, as I honestly just find it to be more challenging as killer in an exciting way, though obviously I still prefer it as survivor. And similarly to Garden of Joy, another map that I really dislike, it fills up the large amount of space with maze tiles, loops, and quick escapes. It results in these convenient chains of pallets and windows for survivors to use to their advantage, and takes away from the quote-unquote thrill of the hunt. The sheer amount of maze tiles combined with the just good enough pallets leads me into playing more defensively as killer. Chasing survivors is often a big risk, especially if they're baiting you to because of the awkward placements, and it's ultimately really frustrating for me as the only other option is to focus on generators, and many of them end up getting completed quickly anyway. If I hadn't said at the start of the video that I main survivor, you'd think that I play killer all the time with the amount of survivor sided maps that are low on the list. I did say that I'd try and avoid ranking the maps solely on balancing, but I think that it's more so a result of correlation rather than causation. I just find that the maps that are harsher against killers are also more likely to have major issues regarding the gameplay. 𝐓𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐻 is essentially just the map that shares a lot of elements with the worst maps and does them a little bit better. I don't think it's awful, it's just pretty mid. 5 out of 10. Backwater Swamp has grown on me since I began playing. It started as one of my least favourite realms, but now I actually enjoy it. Though if I do enjoy it, why is it down here? If I had to encapsulate it in a sentence, the swamp is easily and far and away the most outdated realm in the game. Dead by Daylight, as many people know, began as a small indie outing, and wasn't prepared at all for the massive influx of players and quickly growing competitive scene. For this reason, a ton of the older realms are unfortunately just naturally disadvantaged in comparison to those that came out more recently. Backwater Swamp's issues, however, really stand out in a way that no other realm has to the same severity. I'll agree to disagree with those that dislike the map or think that it's their very least favourite, but there's two criticisms that I hear a lot that I 100% stand by. First of all, this map is just so visually terrible to the point that matches feel uncomfortable, especially for killers but also for survivors. Playing stealthily is a lot less front and center than it used to be, so a realm that is so dark in its colors with very hard lighting just comes off as unnecessary. And as a result, these maps are some of the roughest looking in the game. It is a really big issue holding the realm back, and it needs to be addressed as soon as possible. The second reason comes down to how badly it accommodates killer abilities, such as the absence of lockers in the center to teleport to for the dredge, and plagues cleansing stations often spawning at the borders. It can really hurt my time as killer because I hate having to go to useless places just to use my power. It's a shame that these issues still exist because I actually think both maps are relatively balanced. That is very likely an unpopular opinion, but I find that both maps have a good mix of strong structures combined with some open areas that aren't just dead zones. Off the top of my head, these maps are also among the few with actual ground elevation, mainly near the map edges and the shack. Along with the tall grass, it helps to counter the sometimes comically long sightlines, though only a bit, because as soon as the killer goes up a floor, they can see practically everything. Due to its very weird shape with these prongs of structures jutting out, the Grim Pantry is the one with more balancing issues because it can very quickly become survivor determined, which is a trait I'm definitely going to elaborate on in the next segment of the list. The Pale Rose I think has the better design of the two maps, as it's more open and friendly to killers, but it also has a few great structures for survivors to use, but I still enjoy it less. There's just something about the pantry that gives me a sense of energy, and I'm genuinely not sure why. There just isn't the same variety or feeling of excitement during chases, but the map's design elements on their own are cooler, so it has got that going for it despite the nauseating colour scheme and lighting. The maps are on the larger end, but due to the openness of both, you're likely to run into a bunch of survivors anyway, though this is mostly thanks to the gem placements. Overall, a round that's moved up for me, but is still only okay due to it aging like milk. 5 out of 10. Many people say that Haddonfield is the most egregious example of survivor-sidedness. While it's definitely survivor-sided, in my opinion it's more so survivor-determinant. My definition is that if a map is survivor-determinant or survivor-determined, the match's outcome is heavily reliant on the performance of the survivors. Much more so than usual anyway. A lot of these maps tend to have RNG elements, which means they aren't that great, but they're definitely fairer than explicit siding, and they often host more interesting games. Haddonfield a lot of people really don't like, and I used to be one of these people. I've always loved the aesthetic, but I used to bash it really hard for its weird obsession with completely OP game-changing obstacles. Nowadays I think it's only mildly sided and even somewhat fair, just not quite in a way that I'd like. Instead of evenly spaced tiles, structures and loops that aren't too strong but also aren't weak, Haddonfield just sets apart to a T which areas are powerful for each side. It's sometimes quite unbelievable just how aggressively Haddonfield matches can flip either way. Survivors playing to win who know the map well, or even those who don't, will always try and go for the houses or those car loops in the street. I can't really speak for everyone, but from my own experience, the temptation to infinite loop the killer is always way too strong. This map spawns multiple infinite loops, including that infamous one in the Myers house, and that is unforgivable. I cannot rate a map higher no matter how good it looks or how much I enjoy playing on it if it has these kinds of features. It's one of the easiest ways to speedrun ruining the killer's life. Though with that said, there's also the complete opposite end of the spectrum, which is the map having large swaths of nothing to help survivors, some really strong 3-gen potential, and debatably the most powerful sightlines in the game. The difference between a map like this and Garden of Joy is that while both escalate very quickly, I find Haddonfield can really go in either direction depending on RNG and player skill, whereas Garden of Joy always seems to favour survivors. If a killer is able to identify early on which survivors are going for the safe points, then they can wreak absolute havoc on the team. Again, survivor-sided, survivor-determined. It's a bit confusing of a metric, but I think as I start to get less and less critical, it will really help to explain any contradicting statements I make, such as if I shame one map for having a strong main structure and good connecting loops, but praise another for the exact same thing. If Haddonfield was a little softer around the edges and not the type of map that takes two extremes and mashes them together, I'd honestly put it higher. Lots of potential for future improvement, but for now, it's just okay. 5 out of 10. The fact that I wasn't even going to include Hawkins Lab until it was added back into the game recently shows you just how long I've been merely postponing the inevitable, aka me completing this video. I think this is a decent map that hasn't really got any standout achievements apart from its references to Stranger Things and the neat style, but is at least worthy of being at the midpoint of the list. I personally find the complex to be a bit too killer-sided with a confusing and very difficult to navigate layout. It might be a fairly sized map, but it feels much bigger than it really is because it just keeps going and going and going. In addition, I can't think of that many truly safe places, and having at least one of those kinds of areas is very important to me, and it makes the game that much more exciting as Survivor. The upper floor can give survivors a small boost in chase with that chain of vaults, but it is only one location and comparable to the east and west offices in RPD, in that it is only useful in certain situations when you need to gain some distance. And as I said before, it's not a very big map, so pallets and windows are the only defenses that survivors could naturally have. And as they are, they're very weak. Don't get me wrong though, the map isn't bad. Fortunately, the game being 4v1 just makes it survivor sided by default, so its clear killer preference is not that big of a deal, just frustrating at times. It also has some good connectivity. There's a lot of ways to maneuver around the map, and it makes for some very fun matches with the amount of mind games going on. The complex layout, while irritating at times, means that sightlines are small and gives survivors leeway in terms of escaping chases or just hiding from killers patrolling generators. If Dead by Daylight was a stealth-based game, this would be amazing, but it isn't, so it's just a small, sometimes very useful bonus. Furthermore, while the pallets are definitely weak, they're easy to work around for both sides and allow for some very high intensity chases, which is great. It's basically like Decimated Borgo in this regard, just not terrible, and honestly a map they could use as reference for a Borgo rework. The lab isn't that special, but I'm really glad it made a return to Dead by Daylight. 6 out of 10. The game is perhaps one of the most controversial realms, and it was for a long time my personal punching bag. While I still think that it's only decent, I can say that I actually like it now, as a lot of the things that I originally hated about it have become enjoyable. The only thing that is still unchangingly bad about this map is the pallets. I never thought I'd be using Decimated Borgo as a good example, but at least on that map it doesn't spawn multiple god pallets in a chain. I often find that anyone who hates the game hates it primarily and sometimes only for this reason. It's just the worst case of pallet stacking possible, and there's no excuse for having that many. On the other hand, this map isn't sided in my opinion, but the way that it balances itself is very silly. Either you have all 5 generators finished in 3 minutes, or everyone drops to the floor like dominoes. There is literally no in between. I rarely have a game that doesn't violently swing in either direction, and it makes for a very tense, competitive environment that few maps really have. I usually hate it when matches snowball, but the game just about works for me, because matches there are some of the most exhilarating experiences I've ever had in Dead by Daylight. While that's definitely dependent on who you are and what you like, the realm does have a lot of genuinely good elements as well. The game has really good connectivity, which is one of the biggest saving graces just because of how awful the pallets are. It's another case of extreme versus extreme, but I'll just barely allow it because of the anticipation of where the killer's going to come from or where the survivors are going to bolt. It's also got an okay look, fair sizing, and a really neat gimmick with how a new door may open whenever a generator is completed. It does mean that loops are more immediately available to survivors, but it also does the same with generators for killers. In conclusion, there's some very valid points people have that I just couldn't defend, but I really enjoy the game in spite of its issues. It's not really worthy of a higher position, but it's easily fixable, so maybe Behaviour should have another look into it. 6 out of 10. Coldwind has a lot of maps, so I'm gonna head straight in. Torment Creek I have no strong feelings for. The silo is a weak main structure, but like a lot of the map, it's surrounded by quite a few annoying pallets, though they do get used up relatively quick. I'm starting to sound like a broken record with this, but while the creek isn't big, it feels much bigger because of how cluttered it is. It's honestly not that bad though, so I haven't really got a problem with it, and the ease of patrolling generators as killer really smoothens out the rough pallets. Rotten Fields is also fine, but very strange. Having the shack as your main structure does come off as a little lazy, but it actually just barely works because it tends to be where most chases are centered. There's a ring of dead zones in the fields themselves, which is seen on a lot of the Coldwind maps, and unless the survivors are playing against a killer like Blight, it tends to be the area where things go wrong. though it can be worked around with the tiles and pallets nearer to the borders, which do make up for the relative weakness of the fields themselves and renders Rotten Fields as a somewhat balanced map, despite how large it is. Fractured Cowshed is terrible. It's not as bad as it used to be, but in its current state it is comparable to 𝐓𝐢𝐻𝐸, which paints a picture of just how bad it once was. The map is very cluttered, full of safe chains of vaults and loops, especially with those hay bales, and sometimes just completely broken for killers against a team with at least 1 or 2 good survivors. Pair that with a main building that is not that strong, but often extremely annoying in chase, and well, you get it. Not a good one by any means. The Thompson House is a map I really enjoy. A lot of people like to complain about the main structure being unfair for killers, but it really isn't that strong in my opinion. If you break the doors, then the survivors are out of a lot of power and it becomes only situationally strong. Using breakable doors to determine power level is definitely silly, but it's done relatively well here, so I don't really have a problem with it. Like the other 𝐒𝐲𝐭� maps, it has a lot of tiles surrounding the edge and a dead zone in the middle, which is where at least 1 to 2 generators spawn. I think this map is genuinely quite well designed in this regard because disruption of said generators is very easy, and catching survivors off guard seems like it's a principal element of gameplay on the map. It's also got a passable size, lots of mind gaming potential with its various tiles, and is without a doubt my favourite looking variant of 𝐒𝐲𝐿D. Last, but definitely not least, Ranted Abattoir is one of my favourite maps in the game. It's got a great size at 140 tiles, a fair main structure with difficult to perform running vaults and risky pallets, but also quite a few available, and evenly split portions of dead zones and safe zones that are interlinked well. It's the only 𝐒𝐲𝐿D map that I'd say is truly great. All 5 of the maps have an aesthetic I really like, but often share the same flaws when it comes to their area usage or weird methods of balancing. When compared with Autohaven Wreckers or Macmillan Estate, it doesn't have more than one standout, but it does have a lot of stuff to take from it, whether that's good or bad. 6 out of 10. Midwich is by far my favourite looking map. It might just be because I played Detention recently and I'm somewhat reminded of it, but I just really love the visual style. My favourite atmospheres are those that are rainy or stormy, but also cozy, and this one is basically that exactly. Add a little dash of horror visuals on top and I'm sold. The map's size is perfectly fine, but its one-to-one layout and near identical floors means that the killer tends to move around points of interest faster. It also has this really annoying thing that I forgot to mention earlier for similarly multi-level maps, where the terror radius is the exact same even if the killer is on another floor, and I really don't like that, glitch or not. And along with all of that, hooks often spawn in the worst places possible, such as the ones right in the middle of the corridor, which just act as an incentive to proxy camp for killers willing to go that low, which is to say quite a few. This is probably the most killer sided map, and by a surprisingly large margin at that. Despite that being a lot less awful than survivor siding, it's still quite the blow. As I mentioned previously, the size is fine, but that's only when you combine both floors, otherwise it is tiny. It also has incredibly long, straight corridors that are basically death traps, and in the worst cases, the whole map can become a 3-gen. I mean, it can also become a god loop, but the former is much more likely. I could try to argue that it's another one of those survivor determined maps, but one only needs to have a look at the statistics to realise that's just not the case. The reason I bring that up is because while the layout of the map itself is very forgiving to killers, many of the vaults and loops are pretty solid, meaning that there's somewhat of a learning curve for everyone. The only one that I don't like is the double pallet corner in the courtyard, but those pallets do get thrown down quickly. I should also note that while I don't often get to use it because of my playstyle, this map has a considerable amount of lockers lining practically every room, so if there's a strong 3-gen going on and a need to not be chased from a generator, hiding in one of them sometimes actually works and is a valid strategy I've seen work on both sides time and time again. But yeah, it's definitely killer-sided. This isn't the kind of map where a survivor making mistakes can threaten the success of the whole team, it's just always going to cater toward the killers, even if there's a lot of great ways to counter as a survivor. Still, Midwich is a good map that I really enjoy, though as with most of these maps I'd understand why someone else wouldn't. 7 out of 10. I honestly haven't got that much to say about the Red Forest. It's another realm that I love for its looks but only like for its gameplay, and was a very difficult realm for me to rank. And perhaps the greatest example of that is how Mother's Dwelling is the largest map of all, yet I don't think it's trashy and survivor-sided despite the strong association I made between the two throughout this video. Ultimately, the reason why I think that Mother's Dwelling is passable is that there is a very good selection of pallets and vaults and a small main structure that is almost like a magnet, in how survivors naturally just end up there anyway. It's also quite accommodating to killers that traverse the map in quick succession, such as Blight, as there's a good handful of collision points but not enough to the point that your ability becomes void. That size problem is just so damning though. 188 tiles is just such a what the fuck from behaviour. Please nerf it. The Temple of Purgation, however, is one of my favourite maps to play on, and I think that the balancing is great. Due to the gargantuan main structure, the map is very walkable and connects quite nicely, meaning that chases require a little more effort from survivors than on some other maps in order to avoid disrupting teammates on generators. Also, say what you want about a Babylonian temple in Eastern Europe, but I think it's really cool looking, even if you disagree with its role in game. And even then, it's a pretty fair structure even with the basement's pallets being as weak as they are. This map does have some annoying RNG as well, particularly with that one stupid god pallet that can spawn in the main temple, but there are just enough pallets and vaults that are unsafe to counter it. To me, there's a big difference between multiple god structures full of multiple god pallets connecting to even more god pallets, and the occasional ultra safe chase ending loop, but nowhere else immediate to go to. If I had to summarize my thoughts on the realm in one word, I'd say forgivable. Not the perfect storm, but everything seems to fall into place well enough to the point that I enjoy it, though the temple to me is clearly the star. 7 out of 10. Dvarka Deepwood is another realm that I can't pronounce, and Dead by Daylight's newest as of this video, and a shockingly good pair of maps. They're still not perfect, but you can tell that Behaviour really wanted to make a good comeback after the single worst DLC I've ever seen that I will actually acknowledge. But yeah, let's talk about those maps then, shall we? Toba Landing is absolutely brilliant. It's visually the most advanced map so far with some excellent attention to detail. The colour palette is also very unique to the map. It definitely doesn't feel like our own planet, so they nailed it from that angle pretty well. The central structure is probably the best part about this map though. Not only is it cool to repair a generator on a spaceship, but when it comes to gameplay, it's completely unbiased, which is always a good sign. There's two pretty safe but not godlike pallets below the ship and on the middle floor that I have to say are really fun. Pretty much every pallet fits this criteria. Same goes for the size, it's 136 tiles, meaning that nobody really gets the edge. The map could definitely do without the visual clutter and numerous objects in the way, but it's still not enough to ruin it for me. Nostromo Wreckage was also a real treat. As someone who absolutely adores the first two Alien films and even has a soft spot for Covenant, seeing it finally get added to Dead by Daylight is just so awesome. It's got all of the good parts of Toba Landing as well. Sprawling pallets and vaults with fair balancing, a great visual style that encapsulates the unique flair of the original film, a decent size, and in addition to all of that, references to some of the movie's most iconic scenes, and a variety of neat new map mechanics such as the broken pipes that you can use to stun the killer during chase. Both of these maps could be entirely different realms on their own, but for some reason I feel like having them together would increase the chances of Behaviour adding a jungle themed map from Predator, that is, if they ever get the license for it. Excellent work guys, you really are doing a pretty good job so far. 8 out of 10. Dead Dog Saloon is one of the most overhated maps, and I'd say without a good reason. People say it's very killer-sided, but I think that this is a genuinely really well balanced map, and not killer-sided at all. And of my designated survivor determined maps, it's probably the best, as you can definitely throw away your edge, but it doesn't hammer you for making mistakes. The only parts of this map where the balancing isn't quite there are also the kind that are avoidable and not naturally embedded, such as with the saloon itself. It's a pretty good structure, but once some of the doors are broken, particularly the one on the second floor next to the vault, the mind games really kick themselves into high gear and it's no longer a matter of siding. I'd say that the least balanced part of the map is that very powerful 3-gen on the street, which basically just hands the killer a 4K, but even then, those generators often get completed early. It's not a big map by any means either, but the generators outside of that 3-gen are relatively dispersed, and it means that the killer can't just mow people down. As well as that, another criticism of the map is that sightlines are just too much, but a lot of the generators are multi-level, meaning that survivors have a lot of leeway for head starts, which is something I just don't often see on other maps. The pallets and vaults as well are of a great variety. Some of them are very unsafe and so require some thought, but other more obvious ones like that loop immediately in front of the saloon are great for buying some time. And due to the fact that there aren't similar loops immediately in the vicinity, the killer can actually commit to the chase, without worrying about a chain. As for visuals, it's passable. I really like old Western architecture, but the colour correction on this map is pretty boring and at times just completely unappealing. Apart from Backwater Swamp, it could be the least colourful realm, but there is a lot competing for that title, so it's not necessarily a problem with just the saloon. Finally, I appreciate that the map doesn't have much visual clutter and in turn collision points, but the amount of foliage in parts is just too excessive. Though having it there at all isn't bad considering how quickly the killer can travel. Overall, a realm and a DLC that I thoroughly enjoy. 8 out of 10. Larry's Memorial Institute is the highest ranking single map realm on my list. It's not immune to the law of diminishing returns that I find applies to nearly every Dead by Daylight map, but I think that it's currently the closest we'll get to perfecting what Dead by Daylight maps can realistically offer. Larry's was added to Dead by Daylight before all the bloat and the trashy DLC releases, and therefore is a lot more organic, even if it doesn't necessarily fit in with the game's status quo now. Similarly to Dead Dog Saloon, Larry's is often referred to as a killer-sided map. Unlike the saloon, it is killer-sided to an extent. The map is shockingly small at less than 100 tiles and doesn't even have a second floor. Where the map makes up for it is with how it uses the tiny space. Almost every room is a mind game machine with a good palette and sometimes more than one vault. A survivor who likes jumping through windows isn't a continual slap in the face for the killer, instead it just gets more and more exciting for me. Though this is where my point about killer-siding factors in the most, with how an incompetent survivor can get down pretty fast. I want to say that it's rare to find a survivor who can't perform a vault properly, but that would just be lying. Larry's corridors, while similar to Midwich in their length and presence in the map, are not as direct and often filled with various objects and more frequent exits. It's still ideal for a killer like Huntress, but not necessarily one like Oni. These corridors are much more heavily fortified than those on Midwich, as some very powerful pallets can spawn in. The map is also perhaps the only one that actually plays with the conventions of the killer role. The killer you play and how well you play them having the most influence is a model which I think all maps should try to follow in future, because this is currently the only one that does it right. Stealth killers, for example, perform really well on this map due to the amount of different rooms and walls that obscure survivor vision. I also find that some of the more quote-unquote broken killers like Nurse have nightmare skill flaws, so unless the survivors are some of the biggest idiots on the planet, then it can be pretty challenging, especially for those who can't play her. And by that, I mean me. I genuinely think that maps where Nurse is a very hard killer to learn are more likely to be good than not, just because of how game-breaking she actually is. There are some killers I can think of that kind of ignore the rules of the map, those being Chucky and Legion, who can just vault over everything with you and take away the amazing chase potential in an instant, but their usual counters of just spinning and baiting swings apply here too. It's not like they're completely OP. Killer determined? Maybe. Possibly. As long as nobody gets too big of an edge, especially the survivors, I literally do not care. I hope that Behaviour tries to go back to maps like these. In my opinion, they're the perfect kind of competitive match environment. Some people will never enjoy the very dense layout of the map, but I've never really had much of a problem with it myself. 8 out of 10. I think that 𝐒𝐤𝐴 is so far the best realm that Dead by Daylight has to offer in terms of a balanced experience. The family residence and the Sanctum of Wrath are moderate when it comes to competitive edge, and they instead choose to be relentless and unforgiving. Their extra balanced nature means that games are often ferocious and high energy, assuming that everyone is at least decent. As someone who gets frustrated with games quite often, and especially with this one, these maps I surprisingly rarely ever actually get frustrated with. There's not a single element of either that makes me groan or lose hope. I mean, I still get annoyed, but that's never the fault of the maps is what I'm saying. In terms of visuals, this map also scores really high. I really love how the red sky contrasts with the softer, drowned out greenery and desaturated color correction. It's definitely not my favorite, but I also don't know how it could be made better. It gets along with the spiritual, ancestral setting of the realm perfectly. Oh, and speaking of that setting, the architecture and style of this map is really neat, especially with the shrines and the manor on family residence. Real awesome work. I'd also like to mention that these maps have a very classic early era Dead by Daylight vibe despite not being released that early on. What I mean by that is that it feels like the developers were aiming for a more stealthy experience with the colour scheme and various rocks and obstacles. It definitely stands out for that reason. The most noticeable difference between the two maps is that the Residence is focused more around one pocket, whereas the Sanctum is more evenly spread, with its main structure in the centre. This is really the only element that sets them apart, and if I have to choose, I'd say that the Sanctum wins out just barely because of this feature. The Residence becomes a hotspot relatively fast and stays that way until the generators there have been completed, whereas with the Sanctum it's always changing, though the centre is somewhat of a magnet. Bit of a weird description, but to me, 𝐒𝐬𝐞𝐝 Estate is the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Dead by Daylight. It's one of the few realms that would honestly be better without changes, at least in my opinion of course. It might not be one of the first maps, but it's definitely important to look back on it as an example of how to do a realm right. 8 out of 10. 𝐒𝐨𝐴𝐸𝐿𝐬𝐿 is really strange, but pretty good. It automatically gains some points for being one of the originals. They kind of have an advantage by default because they existed before the real market for Dead by Daylight revealed itself. Like Coldwind, 𝐒𝐴𝐸𝐿𝐬 has 5 different maps, so I'll tell you my thoughts on each of them straight up. The first thing I notice about Azerov's resting place whenever I load onto it is just how gargantuan this map looks and is. It's an unnecessarily long hourglass shape with the shack and a slightly weaker but similar structure at either bulbous end, and there's a fuck ton of maze tiles between them. The map makes up for this size problem by being pretty clever and using its shape to its advantage. Most of the generator spawns are accessible to the killer, and the maze tiles down the middle are a major choke point and pretty good for chasers. Even though it results in a balanced and fun map for the most part, I'd still prefer a cube shaped map or something with more density. Wrecker's Yard is kind of just another rotten fields, but much better. Like the fields, it has a shack as its main structure, but unlike fields, this map is very consistent when it comes to pallets, obstacles and tiles across the map, and there aren't any absolute dead zones off the top of my head. Pretty much every single pallet is fair, and they each offer up an additional mind game. The shack only really serves as a core to reel survivors in, same with the generator placements, and the size of the map only serves as a way to take the killer as far away from the centre as possible. It's not that visually interesting or unique, but it's the best it gets among the 𝐒𝐴𝐸𝐿𝐬 maps for gameplay. Wretched's Shop is probably the most killer-sided of the 𝐒𝐴𝐸𝐿𝐬 maps. Unlike Wrecker's Yard, it does have a main structure, but I think it actively sabotages survivors if anything. There's not many strong pallets on the map at all, though they are pretty unbiased, nice pallets as well. Quite a few places could be buffed up for survivors, like the priorly mentioned main structure, but I don't think it's too awful truthfully. Speaking of which, 𝐒𝐬𝐿𝐬 is in the nicest way possible an absolute fucking mess. It's way too survivor-sided, has a poor main structure for both sides, but especially for killers, pathetic sightlines blocked by these overly large car towers, and it's far too dispersed to make for interesting chases. There really is nothing that good about this map apart from maybe the gas station, which could be a pretty good asset for a true horror game. Unless I'm playing with someone else, I will deliberately off myself on hook if I have a bad early game. This map is just miserable and has no right to remain in the game in its current state, though it's still not as trashy as Badham. To end on a positive note, Blood Lodge is pretty good. It has a small main structure which is kind of useless but also relieving as killer because it isn't that safe, and the map is super open, having some decent pallets and tiles that are evenly spread, and a hot spot where survivors tend to go between the shack and the house. Not too many thoughts on it past that though, it's kind of just good and that's about it. I'd like to note that this and the realm above it are the few that have had their scores inflated. This is because these realms peak high enough to make up for their faults, and most realms except these tend to be disagreeable and subjective. The averages so far have reflected my views pretty much spot on, but here that's not necessarily the case because there's more than 2 maps involved and 𝐒𝐬𝐿𝐬 dented the score quite a lot. 𝐒𝐴𝐸𝐿𝐬 and Wreckers is visually okay, great in terms of gameplay in 4 out of 5 instances, and really enjoyable. 8 out of 10. Map Macmillan Estate is considered by pretty much everyone to be the original Dead by Daylight realm and considered by me the absolute best. This realm apparently has 10 different maps, but 5 of those are just reworks, so I'll treat it as if there are just 5. And of those 5 maps, I only dislike one of them, so let's get that one out of the way first. Shelter Woods is not very good at all. Not only is it the Skull Merchants map, but it's very killer oriented. It's full of very weak pallets and extreme dead zones outside of the core, so its large size makes literally no difference. The campsite is the one part of the map that I actually like. It's a very unique area with its colours and lighting, yet it blends with the rest of the map pretty well. And if it was on a slightly better map, then I could see it working really well. Groening Storehouse I like more than the average player it seems, and I think it's basically just the inverse of Shelter Woods, having a really frustrating main structure but decent surroundings. Though it's also a much better and more consistent map. It plays a lot smaller than it actually is because of how most of the generators orbit the north side of the map, and I actually like that. It does mean as killer I have to go through the storehouse every so often, but there's not much else that annoys me. Ironworks of Misery has my favourite main structure of any map. The sheer scale of it I love, and it can host some pretty great chases. It's a bit too strong of a loop and gameplay wise a little lackluster, but I can overlook it. Its size is passable, but unlike Storehouse it doesn't have an odd shape or dense generators to make up for that size, which is a con. It's usually fine as long as you don't play into chases too much, though it'd be better if there was more of a focus on that awesome tower rather than the rest of the map. Coal Tower is probably on a technicality the best map in the whole game. It's got excellent balancing, a very simple but enjoyable main structure, probably the best tiles in the game, and a perfect size. To me, it's one of the main reasons why Macmillan Estate is so high. Finally, Suffocation Pit is one of my favourites. No ultra safe or annoying structures that control the map, and survivors don't really gravitate to one area more than another. Even though the shape is completely different, it plays like Azerov's in that it's like an hourglass. But for some reason it's a lot more fun here. This map is also much easier to patrol and slightly denser with its generators due to the smaller size. The mine is really frustrating sometimes depending on RNG, but by the standards of most of these maps it's not even that bad. Really what makes this realm the best to me is its consistency if anything. Even when there's a difference in quality, it's usually something that can be overlooked because these maps follow a code. To put it simply, if all maps share a common criteria with others in the same realm, then Macmillan Estate has the best criteria. They all share this rotting industrial look and bluish lighting, as well as pretty fair gameplay, and structures without major learning curves or completely unfair RNG. I'd like it if they could just keep using maps from Macmillan Estate as reference when designing future editions, because then the outline is actually good, and the chance of behaviour ruining it is a lot lower. It's still not a perfect realm, but a really fun one, and nonetheless what I consider to be the best realm in Dead by Daylight. 8 out of 10. Congratulations, you made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Unfortunately, I've been pretty busy recently, so this ranking took way longer than it really should have, and it isn't my best work. Though I'm obviously still new to this whole YouTube thing, so constructive criticism is always welcome and helps me to improve. Feel free to disagree with my list as well, and tell me what you'd change. Reading people's thoughts on my Hitman ranking and how their rankings differed compared to mine was fascinating, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about the realms of Dead by Daylight too. I don't always respond because I'm kinda lazy, but I promise I do read them, so there's that. I've got a particularly interesting and somewhat different video coming out soon, so if you're interested to see what that is, just turn on notifications and it will come at some point. And with that, I have not much else to say. I guess for now, goodbye!